Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Carefulist, the podcast. We are fortunate enough to be able to speak with Christine Davies today. She is the Director of Spiritual Care at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital in New Jersey. Welcome, Christine.
Thanks so much, Katie. I'm thrilled to be here and get to have a conversation with you.
And I know that our audience is going to benefit from it. So thank you for your time today. So let's just dive straight in. I would love to know how you became a chaplain.
Sure. So it's not a typical career path for a lot of people. No one ever really talked about it in school growing up and that sort of thing. But I have always been um, into church. I was a church nerd as a kid, and my family went to the local Presbyterian church. And much to their bewilderment, I really took to it and loved Sunday school and played in the handbell choir and served as a deacon. And I was convinced from a young age of God's presence in my life and that God wanted me to help the most people possible. I was very precocious as a kid, as you can imagine. And I interpreted this as becoming a physician. Probably because my mother was a nurse. I think she kind of helped me along that path. But, I play with stethoscopes and read the Merck Medical Dictionary for fun. And actually then started volunteering as a EMT, so riding in the backs of ambulances. And it was really there where I learned that there's different ways of being with people. So as much as I could provide oxygen, wrap wounds, have a safe transport to the hospital, what I was really drawn to is sitting in the back with the patients when they were scared and being with them and bearing witness to what they were going through. They were in pain. Often they were crying, holding their hand, and just that really simple act of being with them. And then I had my own health issues emerge and wound up in and out of hospitals over the course of several months and wound up being dismayed by the bedside manner of a lot of the physicians that I was coming into contact with. And it was around that same time that the church I had been attending with my family had a new associate pastor. And she just, in between a hospitalization, she took me out to dinner and just talked to me about what was going on with me, how I was coping with everything. And I found more healing in that scenario than I did in any of the medications or the tests that I was doing.
Mhm.
Don't get me wrong, I still take my medications. That's very important. But she really modeled for me and gave me what I would now call spiritual care, attending to someone's whole emotional and spiritual being. So I went to seminary not really knowing what I was going to do. I had worked in some churches and I don't love preaching. I don't love, running meetings as a pastor. I'd done some youth ministry. That wasn't for me either. But I did an internship as a hospital chaplain and fell in love with it and pursued that. And so I've been doing that ever since. And what a chaplain is for your listeners that may not know is we are considered board certified. We're professional. So everyone that is working as a chaplain usually has a master's degree in theology or divinity, and then does a 1600 postgraduate clinical assignment. And now I'm one of the teachers of those clinical assignments, and we call that clinical pastoral education. And we are there to be with people of all faith or no faith tradition. So I happen to be a Presbyterian minister, but I know enough about other faith traditions to know what might be an anticipated need for a patient. And also, sometimes I walk into the patient's room and they say, "No, I don't want a chaplain. I don't believe in any of that God stuff." I say, "That is perfectly fine. Tell me what you do believe. What is weighing on you today?" And
Mhm.
we're really an extra layer of support for patients, families, as well as staff.
Wow. And that is so important, and it can't be overstated how much people need a third party, excuse me, witness to things
Mhm.
and just to have someone to talk to. One of the things that we explore on this podcast frequently is the fact that caregiving and being a patient can both be lonely and isolating.
Mhm.
And not everyone going through these experiences has someone to talk to or that they feel comfortable talking to about what they're experiencing.
Yeah, and sometimes within chaplaincy literature, chaplains are referred to as the intimate stranger. So we are
Hmm.
exactly what you talk about, this third party person, people, that don't know us before a hospitalization,
Right.
but share many things with us rather quickly. And oftentimes my patients or the families I'm working with will say, I've never told anyone this before. And so
Yeah.
my anonymity helps them to be able to really release some of what they've been holding, and the religious nature of my job as well. Sometimes people are very well involved in a congregation, but they don't want to tell their minister, their rabbi, or their imam some of these things, sometimes out of fear of judgment. And so it really helps to have someone who's part of the care team, and so knows some of what's going on, but also can I view myself as someone who creates space for
Hmm.
people, however they want to use that.
Wow, that's incredible. So you mentioned 1,600 hours of clinical training. How does that parlay into what hospital chaplain does on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so and so I'm in the middle of teaching some of that right now. A lot of times our students are seminarian students or sometimes local clergy who are just really wanting to improve their spiritual care skills, or sometimes it's people who are thinking about changing professions and trying out and saying, would I like this before I have to go back to school for it? And so we have a whole mix of people, and it is this group learning process. So some of what they're doing is sitting with patients and then writing up what happened, almost like a play, to say the patient said this and I said this, and going back and forth. And a lot of what we're going over with them is, what made you say this right here? The patient told you that they were afraid of dying. And then you responded with, oh, it's a nice sunny day out, right? There's a little bit of an incongruity there. So we're really training people to be more effective and more professional in their listening capacities. And
Mhm.
a lot of times it has to do with our own backstory and how we use that. So it's about not necessarily sharing or disclosing pieces of ourselves, but being able to tap into whatever the patient or the family may be feeling, because we've had issues like that in the past, even if it doesn't match up exactly. And so that's a lot of it. And then it's doing the clinical work. And so at my hospital, chaplains are automatically called for a myriad of things. We are a level 1 trauma center. And so anytime there is a trauma, which is essentially something that brings someone into the hospital that is not medically related, so a car accident, a gunshot wound, a fall from a certain height, we show up, not because we're going to do anything medical, but because we are the family support person. Because you can imagine getting a call that your loved one's been into an accident. And when you come to the hospital, you're going to be scared, you're going to be overwhelmed. And so the chaplain is the one that we meet them there and sit with them until they get an update. And then we're the liaison with the rest of the team. Then should the patient not recover from their injuries and die, we are there for bereavement support. We do a lot around death and dying. That's probably about 70 to 80% of what we do. But we also do routine visits as well, where we're just kind of knocking on doors, selling our wares, saying that we're available if the patient or family wants to speak. Because even someone who's in for something routine, like a appendectomy, uh, being in the hospital can bring up so much for other people. So just the other day, I was
Yes.
sitting with a patient. They said, the last time I was here, we were saying goodbye to my mother. And so all of that grief kind of just got flooded back in the moment. Or they have a lot of time to think, right? You can only watch so much
Right.
TV or scroll on your phone so much. And so it is this weird microcosm of a time where people are often reflecting on their lives in different ways. And that's what we do as chaplains, is we sit and we talk with them about that.
Yeah. Well, it is such incredible work to do and have those conversations and give people that space. So when you're talking with family members or you're talking with a patient directly, how are those conversations different? Because
That's a great question. Yes.
imagine that they are.
They can be, and I'll teach my students and do it myself, where sometimes I'll say, let's go talk in the hallway to the family, because I
Mhm.
have learned that there are things that the family may not want to say in front of the patient, and vice
Mhm.
versa. So I might say, if the family's there, I might say, oh, go get a cup of coffee. I'll sit here for a little while, and then I can talk to the patient without the family present.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes they will tell me things that they wouldn't in front of the other. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's the exact same thing. So sometimes the patient is saying, I'm ready to be done with all of this. Everyone wants me to be strong and fight, and I feel bad burdening other people, but I'm tired and I don't want to do this anymore. And
Yeah.
sometimes the family will say something similar, like, I'm trying to keep up a positive face and be strong for them, so I don't want them to see me cry. And then, as you know, with caregivers, there's a range of emotional responses. And one that I see a lot, again, when separated from the patient, is just how hard it is and the toll that caregiving has taken on the patient or on the
Yes.
patient's family member.
Mhm.
And then they often will feel anger and so then have guilt on top of the
Right.
anger, thinking, oh, I shouldn't feel like this. Or sometimes for some of the people I'm journeying with, they'll have relief that the patient's in the hospital so that they're not having to do everything 24/7, or sometimes even relief at death because it's been such a long, terrible journey of pain that they have accompanied their loved one on. And so
Yes.
I like to talk about those to normalize that a little bit, because anytime a family member tells me that, they always say, oh, it's so terrible. I know I shouldn't feel like this. I said, no, 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 welcome to the club. Like, I hear this all the time.
Yeah. Well, and that's a key thing to talk about because people feel so much guilt
Hmm.
when they feel relief, particularly after a long journey. Um, you know, I experienced that. My mom had Alzheimer's disease, and it was a very long process. And we'll get to the conversation of anticipatory grief in a little bit, but for me, the process of losing her to the disease was
Hmm.
harder than the actual physical loss at the end.
Yeah, it's
And
the
it's so
loss
much to
before the
process.
loss and the goodbyes. And what I hear from people is that the personalities change so much, and then having to tolerate that and missing who it was before, on top of all of the logistical aspects and emotional
Yes.
burden of the caregiving. Yeah, it is such a difficult place. And I think another factor is, for a lot of people, I think they're in that sandwich generation
Mhm.
where caring for parents, as well as caring for children or nieces or nephews, and trying to work. It's just too much. The
Right.
math doesn't add up of the amount of
Yes.
hours in the day. And we see, especially among women who tend to be the caregivers, there is significant burnout, and then putting their own health to the side.
Right.
Unfortunately, I have seen cases where there's a caregiver that has been, by the patient's side for months or years, and then they wind up getting sick, and in some
Mhm.
cases dying before the person with the terminal illness that they've been caring for, just because they have put off their own needs in so many ways.
Right. And it does take such a toll. I don't have the
Mm,
statistic handy. I'll have to look into it. But um, there is evidence, and it's age-based. The older you are as a caregiver, the higher the risk that you will pass before the person you are
mm,
taking care of.
mhm.
Um, and I don't want to misquote the statistic, so I won't go there. I'll try to put it in notes somewhere. But it is extraordinarily important, not only that you're taking care of yourself physically, but that you do find people that you can talk to because so
Mhm.
much of the mental and emotional burden
Yeah.
of what you're experiencing does affect you physically. So if
Mhm.
you can handle and take care of the mental and emotional part and find support systems like, you know, chaplains at the hospital or your local clergy, um, or any other third party, whether it be counselors or therapists
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
social workers, somebody
Yeah.
to help alleviate that burden. Um, it goes a long way, far beyond just the mental load being lifted, and it
Hmm.
does affect all other areas. So that's incredibly important to think about.
Yeah, and
Um,
people have been so focused on their loved one. Sometimes when I
yes,
walk into the room and I ask about, the family, they'll say, "Wait, what? Me? No, no, no. I could tell you all about them. Nobody asks about me. They're so other focused," which in some ways
yeah,
is admirable. And we need caregivers, and everyone is going to be a caregiver at some point,
right,
in our lives. That is the likelihood.
yes.
And I think there's power in so much of what I do is just ask them basic self-care questions. Well, did you eat today? Are you sleeping? A lot of times they're sleeping in the hospital next to the patient, which I know means they don't sleep very well because it is loud in there and there's always people coming in and coming out. So really looking at what are your basic needs and how can we help to meet those now while your loved one is, in the hands of others that can care for them.
Yes, and thank you for saying that because that's something that I've noticed a lot myself personally and in the conversations that I've had. They want the focus on the person receiving care. And it's because it is their focus that, this person either get well, or if that's not the situation, that they are as comfortable as they can be and well taken care of, they don't want to talk about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a big part of that is the fear of what they're going to say. They
Mm-hmm.
don't want to be honest about what's happening. They don't want to confront the way that they're feeling and the things that they're experiencing for lots of reasons. You don't want to be judged.
Mm-hmm.
You don't maybe want to admit that this is how you're feeling because it makes it more real and
Mm-hmm.
this is actually
Mm-hmm.
happening.
Yeah.
Um, those are very, very difficult things to work through
Yeah.
and to
Or
bring up.
yeah. Or another time people will tell me if I go into how I'm feeling, I'll break down and then
Yes.
I won't be useful to
Mhm.
anyone. So yeah, I think so. And I can't tell you how many times, and not just with caregivers, but with a lot of people, when I ask, how are you doing emotionally? They'll say fine. And I like to rephrase it because fine is not a feeling. So I like to say, a friend of mine told me once that fine stands for feelings I'm not expressing. And so I'm
That's
like, well, if you
good.
were to feel something other than fine, what might it be? But
Mhm.
yeah, there is fear about engaging that for all of the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah. So you know what? We mentioned it before, so we may as well talk about it now. The anticipatory grief. Excuse me. Um, you recently posted a blog on this topic, and it's something that can especially impact caregivers. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what anticipatory grief is so that folks who may be experiencing it and don't realize it can put a name to what they're going through.
Mhm, absolutely. So anticipatory grief is the preparation for a change or a loss that is about to take place. And it involves all of the thoughts and feelings and experiences one goes through when change is clear and inevitable. And I should back up a minute because our society is not fantastic at talking about grief. I think we're getting a little bit better. But I am a believer that grief occurs anytime there is loss. So
Mm,
not just death. Oftentimes we'll talk about grief as associated with death, but it can be in response to all things.
yes.
Loss brings about change. So even happy things like a wedding, right? I have officiated lots of weddings, and there has been some loss that comes with it. I remember I was sitting next to a mother of a bride at a rehearsal dinner, and she was crying, and I thought, "Oh no, does she not like the groom? What's going on here?" So, I kind of asked. I said, what's happening? And what are the tears about? And she said, "Well, I just realized that as of tomorrow, I'm not going to be her emergency contact anymore." So she was taking
Mhm.
this beautiful thing that she was celebrating, but there was also loss tinged with it because it was changing her relationship. So I
Yes.
like to say that grief can be part of so much of our life because if we think about change, change is constant. Things are always changing, and that means loss is constant. So
Hmm.
we're always grieving something. So anticipatory grief can be before someone is dying. It can be related to that when someone has received a terminal diagnosis and either the patient themselves or their family is coming to terms with that. But it can also be for something I think I wrote in the article because it almost seems so silly to me when I was going through it. But I was like, oh, this is anticipatory grief. My 8-year-old son was crying for weeks before the end of the school year because he was going to miss his teacher.
Yes.
And so something as simple as that, and don't get me wrong, he was very excited for summer and he went to camp and had all sorts of fun times,
Right.
but it's a change and it
Yes.
causes adjustment. And
Hmm.
sometimes there can be fear involved in that. There's
Right.
usually a lot of anxiety when it comes to anticipatory grief. And
Hmm.
so to bring it back to, some of the caregiving that we were talking about before, especially when people are going through any sort of cognitive decline or
Hmm.
functional loss over a period of time.
Yes.
A lot of people call it the long goodbye or the
Hmm.
loss before the loss. Sometimes people with medical ailments where their body is just continuing to deteriorate, we'll call it death by inches. So you're kind of losing pieces, of yourself or of your loved one as you go.
Hmm.
And anticipatory grief can be a burden or a blessing, right? So in some ways, it can be a blessing to be with people on that journey. And I'm sure some of your listeners would agree with that. In
Hmm.
other instances, it can feel like a burden
Hmm.
because of all of the emotional labor that is involved with that, and also still not knowing exactly what the end is going to look like or when it's going to occur. So then you're almost hyper vigilant, waiting for it versus, a
Yes.
change that takes place very suddenly.
Right. Yes. And, my personal experience with that, I didn't know the term anticipatory grief for a long time. We were years into our Alzheimer's journey before I
Mm,
found the phrase anticipatory grief. And the moment I saw it, I felt relief because I was like, oh,
mm,
there is a name for what this is,
hmm
and it is the long goodbye. It's many goodbyes, and there are key things that you expect, particularly in dementia. I think, you anticipate when they're not going to remember your name.
mm,
You anticipate when they're not going to remember you or who you are to them.
mm,
Um, there are little things that you don't anticipate, and those are the ones that really kind of sneak up and grab you and
mm,
can be very difficult to process. So, just having a name for it and knowing that it is normal and it is common to experience that, I think is a huge step forward in being able to just accept it and work through it.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you that the giving something a name can
Hmm.
empower someone to say, okay, I see myself in this. I'm not
Yes.
alone. I sometimes people say I'm not going crazy. Like this is the definition of it in a book. This is what anticipatory grief is. It can be
Yes.
really empowering and healing for a lot of people. And sometimes when we know what it is, we can work with it a little bit more.
Hmm.
So I tend to be a fan of having those labels. Sometimes people, don't want those for other reasons. But I think if it helps people to say, I'm anticipatorily grieving this right now,
Yes.
that can maybe also give you language to talk to someone else about it.
Right. And I think it's an important term for the community at large to know and be aware of that it is common and normal for someone going through something to be grieving before there is a final loss and to give them the space they need to process what's happening
Mhm.
and to treat that grief the same as you would
Mhm.
in I don't know if you've personally experienced this, but when you lose someone, those first, 3 days to a week, everybody's super supportive and they
Mm-hmm.
totally understand and they give you all the leeway in the world. And then, like the next week, it's
Mm-hmm.
life as usual, everything's back to normal. And that's just not true. But
Mm-hmm.
anticipatory grief is the same deal. It is a long process and it is a lot of emotions to think about and work through. And you're not just gonna share from Moonstruck, snap out of it. That's just not how it works. So I'm appreciating this conversation because I know that we have listeners who need to hear it because
Mm-hmm.
they're experiencing it, but we also have folks out there who may not be aware that it exists and they can actually support their friends and loved ones even better, just knowing that this is something that they could be going through and open that conversation. Or if they see it, maybe approaching things a little bit differently and giving folks the space and the time to experience those things and express what they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's part of what it means to be human. Is
Right.
to experience all these thoughts and emotions. And just as within regular grief or any grief, um, there can be a variety of emotions associated with it. So
Mm.
sometimes people think of the stages of grief with Kubler-Ross, and actually, present day thanatologists have debunked some of that. And even Kubler-Ross said, "I never meant it to be linear." The way that people have taken it on.
Right. Yes.
And it's much messier than that. So there can be anger, there can be fear, there can be sadness, there can be moments of relief, there can be moments of levity or joy. And
Hmm.
I think the difficult thing is, when all of those things are coming any given day, any given moment, and it can change so quickly.
Hmm.
And I'll say another thing too about other people trying to support caregivers or mourners after the death
Hmm.
is a lot of times I see exactly what you referenced, people falling away after 3 days because our society doesn't know what to do with that, or they focus on trying to cheer the person up. And
Hmm.
so, or they say, call me if you need me or if you need anything, but then that's also putting the onus, on
Yeah.
the person to reach out.
Mhm.
So, I always suggest that people reach out with logistics to say, okay, I'm going to give you a choice between while you're in the hospital, with your loved one right now, I can leave some casseroles on your door, or I
Mhm.
can mow your lawn. Which would you like? I'm doing one of these. And they may say, actually, neither, but could you walk our dog? Right. So sometimes when we
Yes.
give people tangible things that
Hmm.
show our appreciation to choose from, that's easier than them trying to come up with a Rolodex of what they need and arrange for that.
Right.
And then the other recommendation I have, if your listeners are supporting people that are going through grief right now after a loved one has died, is to make a note in your calendar for 3 weeks or 6 weeks after the death and check
Hmm.
in with the individual. Then maybe ask them if they want to go for a walk or go for lunch, and or even it's just a phone call or a card. That can go a long way because, as you said, everyone else has forgot. And don't be afraid to talk to them about their loved one who has died
Yes.
because they don't have
Right.
opportunity to talk to it. And a lot of times people tell me, "Oh, I feel bad. I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to remind them of it." I say, "Trust me, they're already thinking about it." They will
Yeah.
oftentimes be really relieved to be able to have a space to talk about it. And if they're not, they can tell you that.
Right.
But giving people that opportunity to hold that space as well.
Yes. One of my favorite phrases, and I don't know who said it, so I'm sorry to not attribute it, was that grief is love with nowhere to go.
Hmm.
And when you give someone the opportunity to talk about their person, that is giving them a place for their love to go.
Mm.
And
Oh.
so you are helping them tremendously on their healing journey just by sharing stories, If you have a favorite story of their person, share it with them, even if they know it, but especially if you think maybe they don't.
Hmm.
That gives them something new to think about and a scenario to envision them in, and it keeps them close and present.
Mm,
And present, not just here present, but present time wise present. So it doesn't feel like they're in the past. Because one of
mm,
the hardest things is looking forward in your life and knowing that person's not coming with you on this next leg of the journey.
mm. Oh, that's beautiful and something that's so profound to be able to offer people.
Yes. And it's something that seems simple, and it
Hmm.
is simple, but it is a profound gift that you
Hmm.
can give just by talking with someone about their person.
Hmm. Yeah.
And they won't forget that you asked.
Hmm.
So you
Hmm.
should definitely ask.
Yeah. Well, and others have told me I used to run some bereavement groups, and they've said how meaningful it is to hear stories that they didn't know about.
Yes.
And that does, give them that sense of connection. And as you said, like keeping the memory alive. And I'll also point out, I don't
Mm,
know when this will be airing, but especially around holidays or anniversaries of death
mhm.
or people's birthdays, those can be especially tough times. And that might be a good time to reach out to someone that you know that has suffered
Yes,
a death loss.
absolutely. And I would add to that Mother's Day,
Oh,
Father's
yes.
Day.
Oh, I have such a love-hate
Um,
relationship with those days.
Same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I agree. Mother's Day is a really rough one for me for
Mm.
multiple
Mm-hmm.
reasons.
Yeah.
So in that scenario, like this is on topic, but a tangent.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone is looking for a way to observe a holiday like Mother's Day or Father's Day, and it's tough, as sandwich caregiver,
Mm.
I lost my mom, of course, but I still have kids who live at home, and Mother's Day
Mm.
for them is not
Mm-hmm.
what Mother's Day is for me now.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So we have found that we love to go somewhere as a family on
Mm.
Mother's Day or that weekend, or, depending on what the weather does, make Mother's Day plans where we are out just doing something together that we all enjoy as a family.
Mm.
And that is really helpful and wonderful because you can be in the moment and enjoy it for yourself as the person being celebrated. Um, but also, you're giving the younger generation memories with
Mm-hmm.
you on that day.
Mm.
So just something to think about for some of those harder days.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great piece of advice. There's a bittersweetness
Yes.
to a lot of those days. And if your listeners are interested, I wrote a post just about Mother's Day. I wrote one about Christmas as well. There's something called The Longest Night, which I think is the closest thing we have to a global holiday for grief. So
Mhm.
I have some advice on there about how to observe these days and what to do. And one piece that I'll share as it relates to Mother's Day, especially for people in your situation where you're grieving and also people want to celebrate you, is to just hold time at some point. It can be that day or that week, maybe it's the week before, to say, I'm going to honor my mom and my grief in this moment.
Mhm.
Maybe you do something that your mother would love to do. Maybe you visit the cemetery. Maybe you read through the cards, from her funeral. Just so you have something where you're like, I'm setting apart that time, and then the other time of that day or that week, I'm going to focus on the celebrating, because oftentimes people tell me they feel guilt
Yep.
for, celebrating or laughing or enjoying a party, when I'm like, you
Right.
both can be there together. And sometimes if we set apart a time intentionally, that can help us to be more present in the moments when we are wanting to celebrate more.
Right. And so coming back to anticipatory grief in particular, are there resources or tools or conversations or recommendations, I guess maybe is the better word, that you have for folks who are going through that and looking for some sort of support?
Yeah, so there's actually a newish grief organization that is focusing all on anticipatory grief this month called Reimagine. And I
Okay.
believe their website is reimagine.org. So they have a number, I did an Instagram interview with them, but there's lots of interviews that they have right now, as well as resources. So that is one place that I would start that is looking at that, for the month of October.
Mhm.
And then other pieces that I would recommend individuals focus on just as some advice, again, if it's helpful for them. Um, One thing is gratitude. I'm not so great at gratitude. I'm trying to get better at it. People tell me to be grateful, and I, want to tell them exactly where to go. But there are studies that show it can help us in terms of our outlook and our framework, particularly if we are going through something rough. And so
Mhm.
something that I recommend is I call it micro gratitudes, because
Mhm.
often if I ask people, what are you grateful for? They're like, oh, my life, my friends, my family, my house. Like, I get it. You're grateful for all of that. We're gonna put all those things aside and focus on really small things.
Mhm.
Because that can help us to be present in the moment. And sometimes I have to think really hard. So some people do it at the end of the day or the beginning of the day, but I say write down, and there's all sorts of apps for this, or you can just do it in your phone. Write down three short, small things. So it might be something as simple as, the leaves are gorgeous outside right now. Um,
Mhm.
or that one doctor that I was waiting for finally called us back. Or there's kids walking up and down in costumes, with Halloween
Mhm.
approaching. So it could be something so simple,
Right.
but it can take you out of just having to be caregiver mode all the time,
Mhm.
and connect you with other aspects of your life.
Yeah. So that is a great segue into something else that I've been wondering about with your line of work, particularly in a hospital setting. And that is, where do you find joy? Or how do you keep your sense of humor when what you do on a daily basis, I would imagine, can really wear on
hmm
you?
hmm Yes, I have to cultivate it, and I
Mhm.
often advise my students that we have to seek a double portion of joy because our lives are a little unbalanced, seeing as much suffering as we do on a daily basis.
Yes.
One way that I do it is maybe counterintuitive, is that I have a side business of helping to care for people long term. So I do something that's called spiritual direction, where I meet with people online or in person, usually about once a month, and help them focus on their own spiritual lives, and what that's looking like. And oftentimes, a
Mhm.
lot of my clients do have significant grief or caregiving involved. Sometimes they're clergy, and sometimes they are just people that kind of grew up and have issues with the church or issues with the religion of their childhood, and they're trying to find a new way. But what I
Mhm.
love about those times is um, I get to have longer term relationships with people because in the hospital, it's so short term and I see people just on their
Right.
worst days. But if I can
Yes.
see, the joys of someone's life as well as, the suffering, that is a really beautiful practice that I like to do on the side. And then I avoid a lot of things. So I don't watch scary movies. I don't read sad
Yes.
books. I try to play with my kids as much as possible. They are 8 and 10, and so they're
Mhm.
into Pokemon and Legos and video. I
Mhm.
don't play the video games. I'm not very good at those. They won't let me. But just entering into their world a little
Right.
bit certainly helps
Yes.
me. Or, we play hours of box ball. And so while I'm playing box ball, I can't really think, or two squares, what they call it. We called it box ball growing up. I can't
Mhm.
really think about other things. I have to focus on not getting out or,
Right.
and the physical movement is something else that helps me, certainly to kind of take some of the stress and work it out physically. So
Mhm.
I've done triathlons in the past. I really enjoy yoga, so practices like that. And then we live on a small hobby farm and have chickens, and I do beekeeping. My son is trying to talk us into goats. And so there's just something about like being in touch with the land. And certainly for me, that's a spiritual practice of being outside. And also, I can't take myself too seriously when I'm trying to chase the chickens back into the coop because they've gotten out and they're not wanting, to come back. And so
Right.
all of that helps me to be present in the moment
Yeah.
and try to, metabolize some of the grief and the suffering that I've been sitting with.
Right. Yeah. It is such heavy work. And chasing chickens is a really,
Yes, if anyone wants to come to my farm in New Jersey and chase chickens, they are welcome to.
oh, that's so funny. But it gets really to the crux of what you need to be able to do in order
Mm,
to fully invest yourself in both places, right?
hmm
The important work that you do for the community, and then the work that you're doing at home and the family that you're cultivating.
hmm
Um, so you mentioned you see folks in some of their lowest moments. Um, what's the most important thing that you've learned from them? Is there
Hmm.
one or a common theme of things?
Yeah, so I think that the thing that has surprised me the most and would probably surprise others is just how resilient we can be as
Mm,
humans. So I often hear, and sometimes it's people I see in my private practice, or sometimes it's just friends say like, "Oh, I could never survive that if that thing happened to me." But then I watch as people do,
mhm.
survive it, and it's kind of astounding how much our hearts can break, and at the same time, get stitched back together. I don't
Yes.
always see the stitching back, but I've seen glimpses of it later on, sometimes when people have come back to the hospital or I've heard from them after the fact. So
Mm,
I think that is surprising to me, just how much we can stand and still make meaning of it, afterward and on the other side of it. And this may sound really cheesy, but the thing that keeps me in it is as hard as these moments can be, particularly around a deathbed, there can also be beauty in it. So I often think of the word that Glennon Doyle, she's an author, recently wrote Untamed. She coined this term, brutiful, which I love because it's a
yes.
combination of beautiful and brutal.
Hmm?
And that is so much of what I see. And I imagine so much of what your caregivers experience, like the
Yes.
brutalness of the life that they are in right now. And I get to leave afterward, so I'm not carrying a lot of it, but for me, it
Right.
is this beautiful moment of watching sometimes a family come together, expressing their love
Mhm.
for the patient, or even if I'm holding up, a phone or something and someone saying goodbye that way. Again, not ideal, but there is still these moments of that I just would refer to as sacred,
Yes.
where there is still that connection. And so that's what keeps me in it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. One of the things that I heard early on from a friend who had been through a fair amount, and I, was a young mom. I had a toddler and an infant, and my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I was working full time, and I was like, I do not know how I'm going to do this. And she said, it's amazing what you can do when you're not given a choice.
Mm, mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
I have thought about that time and time and time again because it is absolutely true. And
mm-hmm,
to your point, people are capable of unimaginable
mm-hmm,
strength
mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
resilience.
It reminds me just the other day, I was talking to someone whose parent had just been diagnosed with something and wasn't looking good. And the person just kept saying, I can't do this. I can't, I'm not, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I said, no, 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 you're doing it right now. You are doing it. So it's sometimes it's
Yes.
even that reframe of, I don't know how I'm doing this or I can't do this. And like, there's no blueprint. But
Mhm.
you are doing it by showing up, by being here.
Right.
You are living this out.
Yeah. Every little step is a step forward. Every breath is a breath into the next moment. And
Mm,
sometimes it really is that moment by moment
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
that you are going through it, but you are doing it. You're
mm-hmm.
breathing through it, you are stepping through it, and every hour builds into every day, week, month, and before you know it, you're on a podcast talking about it with
Amen. That's
someone
and you're
else.
helping other people. Like that's I think a way that you've made meaning of your experience and now giving back so that others don't have to have that isolation, that shame, that wondering what is going on with me and what is happening with me.
Right. And it's not all roses and candy.
Mm-mm,
There
mm-mm,
are rough days. I still dread Mother's Day.
mm-hmm,
There are happy days mixed with that bittersweet. I wish that,
mm-hmm,
you always sort of see the empty chair,
mm-hmm,
right? And the
mm-hmm.
person who would have sat there.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of good and a lot of
Mm-hmm,
joy still to be had.
mm-hmm,
And I think the important thing to remember is the person you love so much who is no longer physically with you wants you to live your life. And they
mm-hmm,
want you to be the best version of yourself. They would
mm-hmm,
not want you to hold yourself back or to wallow and not enjoy the time. Because part of your gift to them, even though they're not here anymore, is living your life fully
mm-hmm.
and investing your time wisely, right?
Mhm,
Because you're still here. And that
mhm.
that is a testament to them,
Yeah.
the way you live your life.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll ask a family member, especially someone that's gone through a recent death, what would your loved one say to you right now? They were here. What would they say?
Right.
And I can 9 out of 10 times it'd be like, quit crying and get on with it, or something like that. Or like they wouldn't want me to not do the thing that I'm now putting off doing, or.
Right.
And so yes, it's mostly they want the best for you and how do you keep living?
Mhm.
And grief can also have this clarifying aspect to it that you were referring to before, because sometimes it is a reminder of how short our life is and how do we want to be spending it, and knowing that no day is promised.
Mhm.
And so really trying to focus the time that we do have
Right.
into, places that will feed us spiritually, or
Mhm.
fill us with, happiness and meaning in our lives.
Yeah. So you are in a large university hospital setting. We have listeners who might be in a more rural setting or a smaller hospital that doesn't offer clergy. And so, in this talking and conversation about grief and where do you go with your love and your care for the person that you've lost once the caregiving journey ends, um, some people might be interested in volunteering at their local hospital, maybe not necessarily in a clergy fashion, but maybe they
Mhm.
could in a clergy sort of a role. What would you say to those folks? What would they need to do if
Yeah.
they're interested in that?
So I think the first piece, especially if the grief is fresh, is to attend to your own grief and seek out
Mm,
resources, because sometimes when we are caregiving professionally, we don't realize that our stuff is coming out in different ways. So I would advise people, first to really give themselves the time and space, and
mhm.
there's fantastic bereavement groups out there, or therapists, or spiritual directors, or clergy, or what have you. But then if people are finding like, I want to be able to give back because of having gone through this experience, certainly volunteering in hospitals. So some hospitals have, sometimes they call it like a friendly visitor volunteer program, which some of what you're doing is sitting with people that may not have uh, family coming in to see them,
Yeah.
or really just having some conversations about people, about the hospitalization. So that would be a first step. Certainly, if people are interested, I would, and the hospitals around them have it, I would encourage them to look into clinical pastoral education, which acpe.org. Oh no, I'm sorry, acpe.edu is the site where they have a directory, or people can reach out to me directly. I will find them a program if they're interested in CPE. Another area that a lot of people have gone to and have found meaningful is hospice volunteering. Hospice volunteers tend to have a really robust training program. So that would be, and they do a lot of processing with the social workers that are involved there as well. So I think that would be another good thing for people. And then maybe it's, maybe you don't want to go into a hospital. I understand that. If you never want to go into a hospital again, if you spent so much time there. So maybe it
Right.
is about engaging in your community in different ways. Maybe it's about, doing some hours at the food pantry, or something that I make my boys do. They don't like it. Is we go to a senior center and, on Sunday afternoons, and talk and play games with the
Mm.
residents there. So there can be other things that are not as high stakes as being in the hospital or in hospice, but that might
Yes.
still fill that need for contributing back to society, and like you said, putting that love somewhere and onto someone.
Yeah. Well, those are really great suggestions. And the key thing to know is it doesn't have to be a huge time commitment,
No.
right? Going and visiting at a local care facility, like you said, with you do with your boys, it could be a once a month thing for a
Mm-hmm.
couple of hours. It doesn't have to be much. Um, but it is something that gives you the opportunity to not only give back, but forge some new connections.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the challenges a lot of people face when the caregiving journey ends is, what do I do with my time? I was
Mm-hmm.
so focused on this. What can I do? And a lot of caregivers get really, really good at navigating healthcare because they have to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so finding little ways like that you could reach out and maybe help somebody else who's newly on the journey,
Mm-hmm.
or just making connections with folks who don't have support.
Yeah, and something that just came to my mind that some of the cancer centers will do is they need people to give rides to get people to appointments, something like that, or sit with others during infusion sessions. So
Right.
there's no shortage of opportunities for people when they feel ready.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this conversation and insight into what folks can lean on when they're going through this, particularly in a hospital setting. Is there anything else that you think that people should know about clergy in the hospital?
Don't be afraid to talk to us. And you can always ask. I like to say, in a perfect world, every patient or every family member would have the opportunity to meet with a chaplain. I do not have nearly enough staff to make that possible. So, feel free to reach out to either the chaplains or the care team and say, I'm needing some support. Is there someone that can talk to me?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Christine. It was a pleasure.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
All right, listeners, thank you again for your time today, and we will see you on our next episode. Take care.